Subscribe to StoryLab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Empire Builder. Joseph Farmer had built his empire from nothing. At 42, he owned Farmer Industries, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that started as a small construction company in Detroit and grew into a powerhouse spanning real estate, manufacturing, and technology. His hands, now soft from years behind mahogany desks, still bore the scars from his early days laying bricks and pouring concrete. He'd met Sherry Dixon 20 years ago when she was a struggling waitress at a diner near his first construction site. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she served him coffee, and her laugh made him forget the ache in his muscles. Within 2 years, they were married. Within 5, their son Colin was born, a boy who inherited his mother's gentle nature rather than his father's steel spine. Joseph's best friend since childhood, Harry Dalton, had been his right-hand man through it all. Harry came from old money, but had squandered most of it on bad investments and worse habits. Joseph had saved him, bringing him into the company as chief operations officer, trusting him with everything. The three of them, Joseph, Sherry, and Harry, had been inseparable. Harry was Colin's godfather, the uncle who never missed a birthday, the friend who held Sherry when she cried during Joseph's long business trips. The plan had been meticulous. Joseph had spent months preparing for his disappearance, transferring assets to secure accounts, establishing new identities, and creating a network of loyal associates who would help him when the time came. The plane crash over the Pacific was perfectly orchestrated. Debris scattered across the ocean, a mayday call cut short, search teams finding nothing but oil slicks and twisted metal. Joseph Farmer was declared dead, leaving behind a grieving widow, a traumatized son, and a best friend to comfort them both. What they didn't know was that Joseph Farmer was very much alive, watching from the shadows, ready to discover who truly deserved his trust and who deserved his wrath. Chapter 2. The Mask of Mourning. 3 months after the funeral, Joseph returned to his own company as Edmund Graves, a 60-year-old janitor with salt and pepper hair, weathered skin, and a pronounced limp from an old construction accident. The transformation was perfect. Contact lenses changed his eye color, dental work altered his jawline, and months of method acting had changed his posture and voice. He'd studied with a retired FBI undercover specialist, learning to become someone else entirely. Edmund Graves was hired through a temp agency, his background carefully constructed by Joseph's most trusted ally, Abel Mooney, a former intelligence operative who now ran a private security firm. Abel was one of the few who knew Joseph was alive, and he'd helped orchestrate every detail of the deception. As Edmund, Joseph watched his empire continue without him. The board had installed Harry as interim CEO, with Sherry holding Joseph's voting rights in trust for Colin. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Harry made decisions with appropriate gravity. Sherry played the grieving widow perfectly, and Colin was struggling. The boy had lost weight, his grades were slipping, and he flinched whenever adults raised their voices. Joseph watched from a distance as his son ate lunch alone, as other children whispered and pointed. The death of Joseph Farmer had created a media sensation, and Colin bore the weight of that attention poorly. During his evening shifts, Joseph, as Edmund, would listen to conversations, observe body language, and gather intelligence. He installed hidden cameras and listening devices throughout the building, particularly in his old office, which Harry had claimed as his own. The security system answered to Abel's company, making the surveillance invisible to everyone else. For 2 months, Joseph found nothing suspicious. Sherry visited the office occasionally, always dressed in black, always maintaining the perfect image of a widow. Harry was working long hours, making sound business decisions and maintaining appropriate boundaries. Colin came by sometimes after school, sitting quietly in his father's old office while Harry worked. Joseph began to wonder if his paranoia had been unfounded. Perhaps he truly could trust these people. Perhaps his elaborate test was unnecessary. Then came the night that changed everything. Chapter 3. The Revelation. Joseph was mopping the floors in the executive wing when he heard voices from his old office. Through the security monitors in the janitor's closet, He watched as Sherry entered the room where Harry was working late. She wasn't wearing black for the first time since the funeral. Instead, she wore a red dress that hugged her curves, a dress Joseph had bought for her 3 years ago. "The lawyers confirmed it today," Sherry said, closing the door behind her. "The life insurance paid out. $50 million. Harry looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "Good. And the will?" "Everything goes to Colin when he turns 21. Until then, I control it all." She moved closer to the desk, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We did it, Harry. We actually did it." Joseph's blood turned to ice as he watched his wife lean across the desk and kiss his best friend. Not a friendly peck, but a deep, passionate kiss that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. This wasn't a recent development. This was practiced, comfortable, established. "I can't believe he never suspected," Harry laughed, pulling her around the desk and onto his lap. 20 years of marriage, and he never knew his wife was screwing his best friend. He was too busy building his empire to notice what was happening in his own home, Sherry replied, running her fingers through Harry's hair. Too busy being the great Joseph Farmer to see that his wife needed attention he wasn't giving her. And too stupid to realize that his son isn't even his. The words hit Joseph like a physical blow. He gripped the mop handle so tightly his knuckles went white. "Colin is his son," Sherry said, but her voice carried uncertainty. "Is he? When was the last time you slept with your husband before Colin was born? Because I remember spending a lot of nights at your house while Joseph was in China for 3 months, dealing with that manufacturing deal." Joseph's mind raced back to that time. Colin had been born 2 weeks early, or so they told him. He'd been in Shanghai, finalizing the deal that would make Farmer Industries a major player in international markets. He'd trusted Harry to take care of Sherry while he was gone. "It doesn't matter now," Sherry said, but her voice was shaking. "Joseph is dead. Colin is our responsibility now. Our cash cow, you mean? $50 million in insurance, plus control of $1 billion company until the kid turns 21. By then, we'll have figured out how to keep control permanently." Joseph watched as they kissed again, their hands exploring each other with the familiarity of longtime lovers. Then he heard footsteps in the hallway. A moment later, Colin appeared on the monitor, standing in the doorway of the office. "Mom." The boy's voice was small, confused. "What are you doing?" Sherry jumped off Harry's lap, smoothing her dress. "Colin, what are you doing here so late?" "I couldn't sleep. I want to see Dad's office." The 12-year-old looked between his mother and his godfather, confusion evident on his face. "Why were you kissing Uncle Harry?" Harry stood up, his face flushing with anger. "You shouldn't be here, kid. This is adult business." "But Mom, you were kissing him." "Dad hasn't been gone that long." The slap echoed through the office and the security monitors. Harry had struck Colin across the face, sending the boy stumbling backward. "Don't question your mother, you little brat," Harry snarled. "Your father is dead. He left us everything, including you. Too bad his weakling son is next in line for the fortune." Colin began to cry, not the wailing of a child, but the broken sobs of someone who had just lost the last piece of his innocence. Joseph dropped the mop. The metal handle clattered against the marble floor of the hallway. After a year of careful planning, months of meticulous observation, and weeks of growing doubt, he finally had his answer. Janitoring duty was over. Chapter 4. The Resurrection of Rage. Joseph left the building that night and drove to a secure warehouse on the outskirts of Detroit. Abel Mooney was waiting for him, along with 2 other men who had served with Abel in military intelligence. The warehouse contained everything Joseph had prepared for this moment: weapons, surveillance equipment, fake documents, and enough cash to fund a small war. "I saw the footage," Abel said grimly, reviewing the security feeds on his laptop. "That bastard hit Colin." Joseph said nothing as he stripped off the janitor's disguise. The contact lenses went first, revealing his natural gray eyes, cold and calculating. The dental work would take longer to reverse, but he could work around it. For now, he needed to think, to plan, to prepare for a war that would be fought on multiple fronts. "What's the play, Joe?" asked Dean Campos, Abel's communications specialist. Dean had helped Joseph establish his new identity and had been monitoring Harry and Sherry's communications for months. Total destruction, Joseph replied, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone of absolute menace. I want them to lose everything. Their money, their reputation, their freedom, their sanity. But first, I need to know everything. How long has this been going on? Who else knows? I need to find out if Colin is really my son. The third man in the room, Les Hayes, was a former CIA operative who now worked as a private investigator. He'd already begun compiling dossiers on everyone in Joseph's inner circle. I've been digging into their past, Les reported, opening a thick file. The affair goes back at least 15 years, maybe longer. They've been careful, but not perfect. Hotel receipts, credit card records, even some photographs from a private investigator your wife hired to follow you in 2019. She hired someone to follow me? Apparently, she suspected you were having an affair. When she found out you weren't, she kept the investigator on payroll to help her cover her own tracks. He's been helping them coordinate their meetings and avoid detection. Joseph absorbed this information without emotion. His wife had been paranoid about his fidelity while she was betraying him with his best friend. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so personal. What about Colin? Les hesitated. We'll need DNA, but based on the timing, it's possible Harry is right. Colin was born 9 months after your trip to China, but Sherry was already pregnant when you left. The dates don't quite match up with your last intimate encounter before the trip. Joseph felt something cold settle in his chest. Not just the betrayal of adultery, but the possibility that the son he'd loved and raised might not be his blood. It changed nothing about his feelings for Colin. The boy was innocent in all of this, but it added another layer to the deception he'd been living. There's more, Dean added, pulling up financial records on his laptop. They've been moving money. Small amounts at first, but it's accelerated since your death. Harry's been using his access to company accounts to fund personal investments. Nothing that would trigger an audit yet, but it's there. And Sherry, she's been meeting with a lawyer, not your family attorney, but a specialist in corporate takeovers. They've been discussing ways to maintain control of Farmer Industries beyond Colin's 21st birthday. Joseph studied the photographs and documents spread across the table. His wife and best friend hadn't just betrayed him personally. They were planning to steal his life's work and destroy his son's inheritance. They'd turned his death into their opportunity, his trust into their weapon. I want constant surveillance on both of them, Joseph ordered. I want to know every conversation, every meeting, every transaction. I want to know what they eat for breakfast and who they talk to in their sleep. What about Colin? Abel asked. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. The boy was either his son or Harry's, but either way, he was being manipulated and abused by people who should have been protecting him. Regardless of blood, Colin was a victim here, and Joseph had never let victims suffer when he had the power to help them. Colin is off limits to them from now on, Joseph decided. I want him protected, but I want him to remain unaware that I'm alive. When this is over, I'll decide how to handle that situation. And your targets? Joseph smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Harry and Sherry wanted Joseph Farmer dead, so they could inherit his empire. Let's see how they handle having that empire become their prison. Chapter 5. Gathering the Army. Over the next 2 weeks, Joseph assembled his forces. His network of allies reached far beyond Abel's security team. He had cultivated relationships across multiple industries during his rise to power, and many of those relationships were built on mutual benefit rather than simple loyalty. When Joseph Farmer called in favors, people listened. His first recruit was Arturo Velasquez, a federal prosecutor who had been investigating corporate corruption for 20 years. Joseph had helped Arturo's brother avoid bankruptcy 5 years earlier, and Arturo had never forgotten the favor. When Joseph explained his situation, carefully omitting the illegal surveillance and his plans for personal revenge, Arturo agreed to investigate Harry's financial irregularities. If he's been stealing from the company, even small amounts, I can build a case, Arturo promised during their meeting at a private club downtown. Corporate theft, fiduciary breaches, fraud, the charges add up quickly. Joseph's second ally came from an unexpected source. Genevieve Kuhn had been Joseph's secretary for 15 years before retiring 6 months before his staged death. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had managed Joseph's schedule, screened his calls, and often knew his business better than he did. When Joseph contacted her as Edmund Graves, claiming to be a private investigator hired by a concerned shareholder, she immediately knew who he really was. "Joseph Farmer, you magnificent bastard," she whispered when they met at her apartment. "I knew you weren't dead. The way you handled that quarterly report the week before your accident, you were tying up loose ends, not making long-term plans. Can I trust you, Genevieve?" "With anything except forgiveness for that cheating which you married," she replied sharply. "I never liked Sherry, and I always suspected Harry was a snake. What do you need?" Genevieve's value wasn't just in her knowledge of the company. She had maintained friendships with current employees, and many of them still confided in her. Through her, Joseph learned that morale was declining under Harry's leadership, that several key executives were considering leaving, and that rumors about Harry's relationship with Sherry were beginning to circulate among the staff. Joseph's third major ally was Barbara Potter, who ran the city's most exclusive private school, the same school Colin attended. Barbara's institution had been built with donations from wealthy families, including a substantial contribution from Joseph 5 years earlier when he'd funded their new science wing. When Joseph explained that he was concerned about Colin's welfare following his father's death, Barbara agreed to provide detailed reports on the boy's behavior and well-being. "Colin is struggling," Barbara reported during their confidential meeting. "His grades have dropped significantly, and he's become withdrawn from other students. More concerning, he's shown signs of anxiety around adult authority figures, particularly men. Our counselor believes he may be experiencing some form of emotional abuse at home." This information confirmed Joseph's worst fears about Colin's situation, but it also provided him with ammunition. If he could document that Colin was being mistreated, he could use that information to justify more aggressive intervention. The most dangerous ally Joseph recruited was Mickey Gibbons, a man with extensive connections to both legitimate and illegitimate enterprises throughout the Midwest. Mickey had started as a loan shark but had evolved into something more sophisticated, a facilitator who could obtain anything from legal documents to untraceable weapons, depending on what his clients needed and what they were willing to pay. "You want them destroyed, not just defeated," Mickey observed during their meeting at a seedy bar on the wrong side of town. "That's going to require resources and methods that your lawyer friends can't provide." "What did you have in mind?" "Psychological warfare. We make them paranoid, scared, constantly looking over their shoulders. We turn their stolen paradise into a living hell, and we make them destroy themselves, try to figure out where the attacks are coming from." Mickey's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Rather than direct confrontation, they would wage a campaign of subtle terrorism. Anonymous threats, mysterious accidents, financial pressures that couldn't be traced back to Joseph. They would make Harry and Sherry believe that their crimes had been discovered by unknown enemies, forcing them into increasingly desperate and self-destructive actions. "The beauty of this approach," Mickey explained, "is that they'll never suspect a dead man is coming for them. They'll blame competitors, disgruntled employees, even each other. By the time they realize what's really happening, it will be too late to save themselves." Joseph approved the plan, but with one crucial modification. Colin's safety was paramount. Any action that might put the boy at risk was forbidden, and if protecting Colin required revealing Joseph's survival, so be it. As the meeting concluded, Joseph felt the familiar satisfaction of a well-organized campaign. He had legal pressure from Arturo, inside information from Genevieve, documentation of child welfare issues from Barbara, and psychological warfare capabilities from Mickey. His enemy had superior position but inferior intelligence. They thought they were safe because their opponent was dead. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Chapter 6: The Web Titans. The psychological campaign began with subtle incidents that could be dismissed as coincidence. Harry's luxury car developed recurring electrical problems that left him stranded 3 times in 2 weeks. Sherry's credit cards were mysteriously declined at expensive restaurants, forcing embarrassing conversations with managers who had to verify her identity. Anonymous packages arrived at their homes containing photographs of them together. Not threatening, just proof that someone was watching. Meanwhile, Joseph continued his intelligence gathering through his network of allies. Genevieve had learned from her former colleagues that Harry was making increasingly erratic decisions at work, canceling meetings without explanation and demanding constant updates on company security measures. Sherry had been asking questions about international banking and extradition treaties, suggesting she was planning an exit strategy. The financial pressure came next. Arturo's investigation had uncovered enough evidence of Harry's theft to freeze several of his personal accounts, pending a federal review. The amounts were relatively small, less than $2 million over 5 years, but the investigation created exactly the kind of official scrutiny that made criminals nervous. "He's been smart about it," Arturo reported during one of their meetings. "Small transfers to accounts he controls, disguised as legitimate business expenses. But there's enough here to charge him with multiple felonies if we want to proceed." "Not yet," Joseph replied. "Let the investigation continue, but don't file charges. I want him to know he's being watched, but I want him to think he still has time to cover his tracks." The most effective psychological pressure came from Mickey's operations. Harry began receiving late-night phone calls where the caller would hang up immediately. His home security system developed glitches that would trigger false alarms in the middle of the night. Surveillance cameras around his house were subtly adjusted to point in different directions, making it obvious that someone had been on his property without actually damaging anything. Sherry's harassment was more sophisticated because Mickey understood that women often responded differently to intimidation. Instead of direct threats, she began experiencing incidents that attacked her vanity and social status. Her hairdresser canceled appointments at the last minute, claiming mysterious scheduling conflicts. Her favorite boutiques were suddenly unable to find items in her size. Invitations to social events were rescinded without explanation. The campaign's masterstroke came when Mickey arranged for both Harry and Sherry to receive identical anonymous letters on the same day. The letters contained a single sentence: "We know what you did to Joseph." The effect was immediate and dramatic. According to Genevieve's sources within the company, Harry called an emergency meeting with the security staff, demanding a complete review of all access logs and surveillance footage. Sherry hired a private bodyguard and had new locks installed throughout her house. Both of them began varying their routines, taking different routes to work and avoiding public appearances together. "They're starting to turn on each other," Mickey reported with satisfaction. Harry thinks Sherry told someone about their relationship. Sherry thinks Harry's theft was discovered and she's guilty by association. Neither of them trusts the other anymore. This paranoia created an opportunity Joseph had been waiting for. With their relationship under strain and their judgment compromised by fear, Harry and Sherry would be more likely to make mistakes, and Joseph intended to give them plenty of opportunities to destroy themselves. The trap was set during a board meeting where Harry, increasingly desperate to maintain control, made a proposal that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He suggested selling Farmer Industries' most profitable division to a foreign conglomerate for far below market value, claiming it was necessary to streamline operations and focus on core competencies. The board members were shocked by the proposal, particularly since it would eliminate nearly 30% of the company's revenue. Several directors demanded detailed financial projections and independent valuations before considering such a drastic move. What they didn't know was that the foreign conglomerate in question was actually a shell company controlled by Mickey's associates. If the sale went through, Harry would receive substantial kickbacks while appearing to act in the company's best interests. It was a desperate gambit designed to provide him with enough cash to disappear if the federal investigation intensified. But Joseph had anticipated this move. Through Arturo's connections, he arranged for the Securities and Exchange Commission to receive an anonymous tip about the proposed sale, triggering an investigation into potential market manipulation and insider trading. The SEC's involvement would freeze any major corporate transactions until their review was complete. When Harry learned about the SEC investigation, his carefully maintained composure finally cracked. According to Genevieve's sources, he spent an entire afternoon screaming at his assistant, accusing various employees of sabotage and demanding to know who had leaked information about the board meeting. The psychological pressure was working exactly as planned. Harry and Sherry were isolated, paranoid, and making increasingly desperate decisions. But Joseph knew that cornered animals were often the most dangerous, and he needed to be prepared for their final, desperate moves. The end game was approaching, and Joseph intended to be ready for it. Chapter 7. The Dead Man's Hand. The confrontation Joseph had been orchestrating finally erupted during what should have been a routine evening at the Farmer mansion. Colin was staying late at school for a science project, leaving Harry and Sherry alone to deal with the mounting pressure of their situation. Joseph watched through hidden cameras as they paced through his former home like caged animals, their paranoia and mutual suspicion reaching a breaking point. "Someone knows," Sherry kept repeating, wringing her hands as she stared out the living room windows. "Someone knows about us, about the money, about everything." Harry was drinking heavily, his third scotch in an hour, and his usual smooth demeanor had been replaced by manic agitation. "It has to be someone inside the company. Maybe that bitch Genevieve is still feeding information to competitors. Maybe one of the board members is trying to stage a coup. Or maybe," Sherry said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "Joseph isn't really dead." The words hung in the air like a curse. Harry stopped mid-pace, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We saw the wreckage. We attended the funeral. The insurance company paid out $50 million. They don't do that without being absolutely certain. But what if he suspected something before the crash? What if he faked his death to test us?" Harry's face went pale. In his growing paranoia, the impossible was beginning to seem plausible. If Joseph were alive, he would have confronted us by now. He wouldn't play games. He'd come for us directly. Would he? Remember how he destroyed Marcus Blackwell when Marcus tried to steal that contract in 2018? Joseph didn't confront him either. He systematically dismantled Marcus's business, destroyed his reputation, and drove him to bankruptcy. Marcus never even knew what hit him until it was too late. Joseph smiled grimly as he watched this conversation unfold. Sherry had always been more perceptive than Harry, and she was beginning to understand the true nature of the threat they faced. But understanding and being able to do anything about it were very different things. The breaking point came when Colin arrived home earlier than expected. The boy had finished his project early and taken the school bus home, walking into a house where two adults were drinking and arguing in increasingly frantic tones. "Mom," Colin called out as he entered the living room. "Is everything okay?" Sherry and Harry immediately tried to compose themselves, but Colin wasn't fooled. At 12 years old, he had learned to read the signs of adult distress, and he could see that something was seriously wrong. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Sherry said, forcing a smile. "Uncle Harry and I were just discussing some business matters." "Why do you look scared?" Colin asked with the directness that only children possess. That simple question triggered something in Harry. Whether it was the alcohol, the stress, or the fear that had been building for weeks, he exploded. "Because your mother is an idiot who thinks dead men can come back to haunt us," he screamed, grabbing Sherry by the shoulders and shaking her. "Because we're being stalked by ghosts and investigated by the government and watched by people we can't see." Colin backed away, terrified by Harry's outburst. "Uncle Harry, please stop. You're scaring me." But Harry was beyond reason. "Scared? You want to know what scared means? Your father is supposed to be dead, but someone out there knows what we did. Someone knows we've been together. Someone knows about the money. Someone knows everything." "What are you talking about?" Colin's voice was barely a whisper. "Your precious father isn't the saint you think he was," Harry continued, his words slurring slightly. "And your mother isn't the grieving widow she pretends to be. We've been laughing at his memory while we spend his money and sleep in his bed." Joseph had seen enough. Through his network of allies, he triggered a series of events that would bring this situation to its inevitable conclusion. Abel received a text message that activated a prearranged emergency protocol. Within minutes, Child Protective Services received an anonymous call reporting domestic violence at the Farmer residence. The call included audio recordings of Harry's threats and abuse, along with detailed documentation of Colin's declining welfare over the past year. Simultaneously, Arturo's investigation reached its climax. Armed with warrants obtained through expedited judicial review, federal agents moved to arrest Harry on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit grand theft. The timing wasn't coincidental. Joseph had orchestrated everything to happen simultaneously, ensuring that Harry and Sherry would be overwhelmed by multiple crises they couldn't possibly handle. As sirens wailed outside the mansion, Joseph made his final move. He walked through the front door of his own home for the first time in over a year, no longer disguised as Edmund Graves, no longer hiding in shadows. He was Joseph Farmer, risen from the dead to claim what was his. Colin saw him first. The boy's eyes widened in shock, then disbelief, then desperate hope. "Dad," Colin whispered. "Hello, son," Joseph replied, his voice gentle despite the fury burning in his chest. "I'm sorry you had to see all this." Harry and Sherry turned toward the voice that should have belonged to a ghost. Sherry's face went white as porcelain, while Harry's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally, absolute terror. "Joseph," Sherry breathed. "But you died." "Did I?" Joseph asked calmly, stepping further into the room. "Or did I just give you enough rope to hang yourselves?" Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The next several hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of destruction. Federal agents arrested Harry as he tried to flee through the mansion's back garden, tackling him to the ground as he screamed about dead men and impossible vengeance. The charges against him were extensive and ironclad. Arturo had spent weeks building a case that would put Harry in federal prison for the next 20 years minimum. Sherry's arrest came an hour later, once the Child Protective Services investigation had documented Colin's situation and established grounds for endangering the welfare of a minor. But her legal troubles were just beginning. The private investigator she had hired to cover her affair had been secretly recording their conversations for years, creating a blackmail insurance policy that Mickey's associates had recently acquired. The recordings proved conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, which carried its own federal penalties. But Joseph wasn't satisfied with simply destroying them through the legal system. That would have been efficient, but it wouldn't have been personal. As Harry and Sherry were processed through the criminal justice system, Joseph implemented the final phases of his revenge. Harry's elderly mother, Thelma Dalton, received a visit from a well-dressed young man who introduced himself as a journalist investigating corporate corruption. The young man, actually one of Mickey's associates, presented her with detailed evidence of her son's crimes, along with photographs of Harry's luxurious lifestyle funded by stolen money. When the story appeared in newspapers the following week, it destroyed Harry's reputation in the social circles where the Dalton family name had meant something for generations. Sherry's punishment was more intimate and devastating. Joseph had discovered that her greatest fear wasn't prison or poverty, it was being alone. Through careful manipulation of the media coverage, he ensured that her affair and its consequences became a cautionary tale broadcast throughout their social circle. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Charity organizations removed her from their boards. The country club, where she had held court for 15 years, revoked her membership. More cruelly, Joseph arranged for Sherry to learn the truth about Colin's parentage through DNA testing ordered by the court as part of the custody proceedings. The results confirmed what Harry had suspected. Colin was indeed Harry's biological son, not Joseph's. But by then, Harry was already serving his federal sentence, and Sherry was facing her own imprisonment. The revelation created an exquisite irony. Sherry had betrayed Joseph with his best friend and raised another man's child as Joseph's heir. But now that man was in prison, and she was powerless to claim any connection to the fortune she had tried to steal. Colin would grow up knowing the truth about his parentage, but legally and practically, Joseph remained his guardian and beneficiary. Joseph's treatment of Colin was perhaps the most complex aspect of his revenge. Despite learning that the boy wasn't his biological son, Joseph felt no diminishment of love or protective instinct. Colin was innocent of his parents' crimes, And more importantly, he was the victim of their selfishness and greed. I know this is confusing, Joseph told Colin during one of their first conversations after the truth came out. I know you're angry and scared and you don't understand why the adults in your life have been lying to you. Are you my real father? Colin asked, his voice small and hurt. I'm the father who chose you, who raised you, who loves you regardless of biology, Joseph replied. Harry provided genetic material, but I provided everything else that matters. The choice of what to call me is yours. Colin was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the resilience that children often display in impossible situations. Can I still call you Dad? I'd be honored if you did. The conversation established the terms of their relationship going forward. Joseph would not pretend that biology didn't matter, but he would not let it define their bond either. Colin would grow up knowing the truth about his origins, but he would also know that love and commitment meant more than shared DNA. Chapter 9. Empire Reclaimed. 2 years after his resurrection, Joseph stood in his office, reclaimed from Harry's brief occupation, and surveyed the empire he had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. Farmer Industries was stronger than ever. Its value increased by 40% since his return. The federal investigations had actually helped the company by exposing and eliminating the inefficiencies and theft that had been bleeding money for years. Harry was serving a 25-year sentence in federal prison, his appeals exhausted and his fortune depleted by legal fees. The man who had once lived in luxury now worked in the prison laundry for 30 cents an hour, his future measured in decades of concrete walls and institutional food. Joseph had arranged for Harry to receive regular updates on Colin's achievements, honor roll certificates, sports trophies, college acceptance letters, a constant reminder of the family he had destroyed through his greed and betrayal. Sherry's fate was more complex, but equally devastating. She had served 18 months in prison for her role in the insurance fraud, but her sentence was reduced due to her cooperation with federal investigators. However, her cooperation had come at a price. She was forced to provide detailed testimony about her affair with Harry, her knowledge of his theft, and her own attempts to manipulate Joseph's will and estate planning. Upon her release, Sherry discovered that Joseph had prepared one final humiliation. Using his connections and resources, he had arranged for her to be offered a job as a waitress at the same diner where they had first met 20 years earlier. The job came with a modest salary, basic health insurance, and the daily reminder of what she had lost through her choices. Sherry's attempts to rebuild her life were systematically undermined by Joseph's network. Potential employers received anonymous tips about her criminal history. Landlords were warned about her character and reliability. Social invitations were mysteriously rescinded. She was not physically harmed or directly threatened, but she was completely isolated from the world she had once inhabited. The most elegant aspect of Joseph's revenge was that Sherry could never be certain which of her misfortunes were orchestrated and which were simply the natural consequences of her actions. This uncertainty drove her to paranoia and desperation, making her increasingly unreliable and unemployable. She became a cautionary tale whispered about in the social circles she had once dominated. Colin, now 14 and thriving under Joseph's guidance, had grown into a confident young man who understood both the power and responsibility that came with the farmer name. He knew the truth about his biological father, but he had chosen to honor the man who had raised him rather than the one who had contributed nothing but DNA and destruction. Do you ever regret what you did to them? Colin asked during one of their regular evening conversations. Joseph considered the question seriously. I regret that their actions made my response necessary. I regret that you had to witness the ugliness of adult betrayal at such a young age. But I don't regret protecting what I built or ensuring that treachery has consequences. What if they had just asked for forgiveness instead of trying to steal everything? Then they would have received forgiveness, Joseph replied without hesitation. But they didn't betray me in a moment of weakness or passion. They planned and schemed and celebrated my supposed death. They struck my child and mocked my memory. Those actions revealed their true character, and I responded accordingly. Joseph's philosophy had always been simple. Loyalty was rewarded, betrayal was punished, and the scale of the response matched the scale of the offense. Harry and Sherry had tried to steal his life, his legacy, and his child's future. They had received precisely the fate they had earned through their choices. Standing in his office as the sun set over Detroit, Joseph felt the satisfaction of a man who had reclaimed everything that was rightfully his. His empire was secure, his enemies were defeated, and his son, biological or not, was safe and loved. The dead man had returned to judge the living, and justice had been served with compound interest. Joseph Farmer had built his empire twice, once through hard work and vision, and once through cunning and ruthless determination. Both constructions would stand as monuments to a simple truth. There were consequences for betraying a man who never forgot a debt, whether it was owed in loyalty or vengeance. The reckoning was complete, and the Farmer name would endure long after those who had tried to destroy it were forgotten by history.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.